Good evening, everyone, and a really warm welcome to Ipswich Minster, both those in person but also those online, for this, the 6th instalment of our A Church for England series. Here we are seeking to create a space where we can explore what a good Church of England should look like for the nation it serves through the lens of the most vital issues of our time. And tonight we explore one vital issue that I fear is far too often overlooked, not least by the Church of God. That issue is Christian unity. Now, this is a vital issue for our time, but more than that, indeed for all time, because it is one that Christ himself specifically calls us to, and not least in his prayer in John's Gospel, chapter 17, where he calls his church to be one as he and the Father are one, so that the world may believe. To help us explore that more deeply tonight, we are deeply honoured to welcome as our speaker a dear friend and brother, Father Dragos Herescu. Father Dragos is a priest in the Romanian Orthodox Church and is currently the principal of the Institute for Orthodox Christian Studies in Cambridge. IOX, as it is commonly known, is an institute that provides education and training for clergy and laity at a variety of levels, and crucially is a pan-Orthodox church institute, blessed for its work by the Orthodox hierarchs across Western Europe. And it will come as no surprise then that with an institute like this, based in a nation as diverse as this, and not least when it comes to Christian churches and denominations, that Father Dragos has spent much of his ministry devoted to deepening the understanding between traditions and encouraging us all to recognise the riches we share in Christ. And this evening, Father Dragos will continue with that work by helping us in this way. He will help us see ourselves as the Church of England from the perspective of the Orthodox Church, and help us reflect on what it would look like for us not just to be better neighbours, but to be better sisters and brothers in Christ as the Church of England. And so I am really excited to welcome my friend, my brother, Father Dragos, to the Minster tonight. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much, Father Tom. Thank you so much. I want to start by saying how honored I am and delighted that I have a chance to speak to you and with you this evening in this beautiful church. And thank you so much for the invitation, Father Tom. Now, I really want to start by saying something on a personal level. As you were sort of hinting in your introduction, I've been living in England for almost 19 years. And a lot of my theological becoming and my Christian formation sort of in this, second part of my life, in a sense, after uni and after, in my basically 30s and so on, has had to do with learning, in a sense, from the Church of England. And from my interaction with students, I teach in Cambridge, and I used to teach Anglican ordinance for a good part of my time in Cambridge. And that was it was a formative experience for me as well, pastorally, theologically. And I really want to say that I have a kind of a soft spot for the Church of England. And not in a sentimental way, but I think in a sense that throughout these years, by being here and by interacting, by, in a sense, seeing the Church of England in action, not as an institution, but through people like you, at the very end of its structures, as it were, I have learned what it means to be ecumenical, and I've learned a little bit more what it means to be faithful to my own church and to my own sort of faith tradition. So in that sense, what I'm going to say I say, to a degree, obviously in personal name, but also as sort of with a sense of gratitude about my experience with the Church of England, both as someone, as I said, who is involved in teaching about education, or theological education, and someone who also serves as a parish priest for an Orthodox community in a very ecumenical context like Cambridge. Good. So, as I was saying, I've learned what it means to exist ecumenically, I think, not by some transactional fiat, but as part of the living out of one's ecclesial identity or ecclesial reality because of my interaction, particularly with the Anglican Church, with the Church of England. As I said, I don't want to romanticize this, but I think it speaks to a factual disposition that I can perceive in the Church of England towards dialogue and receptivity. And this can act also, some might say, as an Achilles heel, to be so disposed to be, I think, receptive and to be, to enter into dialogue with other Christians, with other communities and other faiths, not just Christian communities of other faith. It comes with vulnerability and comes with risk. And often I felt that, I don't take this the wrong way, the Church of England feels like the canary in the coal mine. What do I mean by this? To an extent, in relation to society, because to the culture shifts that we've experienced. I mean, for the better part of, let's say, 20 years I've been here, I mean, society has changed so much. And the Church of England, as an established church, has had to respond in a different way to all of these changes in society. It feels a duty to respond, to stay relevant, and all the things that come associated with that role. But also, the Church of England sort of is the canary in the coal mine because it signals, I think, to other churches, to other faith communities, well, these are things that eventually you will have to deal with. Don't ignore them. Don't sort of shove them under the carpet. And often I think it's good to take notice of how the Church of England deals, sometimes very imperfectly, but often with great sensitivity to these cultural shifts, social shifts that we have in society. And on the other side, sort of it acts as a canary in the coal mine in relation to ecclesial issues, which are born often out of these social or cultural shifts. Now, I thought, how can I structure what I want to say this evening so I don't ramble and I don't, as I said, fall into a lot of kind of personal anecdotes about my experience with the Church of England. So I really want to focus on a few key words like accountability, receptivity, receptive ecumenism, to put it this way, and maybe to reflect as a third item on my list, I think, on sort of what can we learn from this interaction? What do I take out of this interaction or that I have had with the Church of England? What can we learn ecumenically? What do we move forward in this sense? So, and one has to say that the whole ecumenical movement, we are engaged in this ecumenical partnership, dialogue, encounter, because Jesus told us to do this. In John 17, verses 20, 21, these famous verses, when he prays to the Father together with his disciples at the Last Supper, here Jesus says, I do not ask for these only, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, that they may all be one, just as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they may also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. So whatever we do in our own communities, in our own churches, we cannot ignore. This is in a sense a very haunting, a very and daunting word of Christ to all Christians until the end of time, I suppose. But where does this unity in practice, where can it begin? I think it can begin, and it should begin, and this is in my experience of the Church of England, that it can begin from considering reciprocally our vulnerabilities. That might feel like sort of anti-intuitive, not such an intuitive place to go, because most times when people are engaged in some form of ecumenical encounter, they fly their best colors, they put up their best, behavior and all this stuff. And you don't really see vulnerability in there. But I think that's the place where we all need to start. And again, I think that's something that I could notice as a thing, as a trend, as an orientation in my interaction with the Church of England. So we start from our vulnerabilities, not our strengths. And this requires receptivity. And receptivity is never divorced from accountability, because I think they go together. Otherwise, it's really kind of a very slippery slope to only be receptive to something. You have to hold it back with some form of accountability. And I would go as far as to say that receptivity is only truly present when it is married with accountability towards the gospel, towards your own context, towards your own tradition, and your experiences. But accountability does not equal rigidity, rather a sense of plasticity and elasticity rooted in always being fit for purpose and receptive to the needs of the time to make the gospel relevant. And I want to share with you a little story that happened to me, which really made me, just cemented this thing, this perspective in my mind. A couple of years ago, I was meant to deliver a talk in Salzburg for a fairly important ecumenical gathering. And he's 6 now, but then he was about 4 years old son. As I was getting ready, putting my cassock on to go there, we're sitting we're having a room there in that place where the event was happening. He managed somehow to wrestle with me and really kind of, managed to rip out one of my buttons in the cassock. And we didn't have anything to kind of stitch it together. I can't remember exactly how we managed. I was like, what am I going to do now? I can't really put this on because it'll just flap all over the place. So I think my wife found a pin or something. She just put it there. I was very careful how I sit and how I walk. But what that taught me, and I was meant to be there and stand and talk and, appear not vulnerable, but erudite and all this stuff. And that really taught me, made me think sort of that our ecumenical life together, meetings like this one that we're having this evening, in our parishes or at ecumenical encounters, conferences, I think in order to be fruitful, have to be rooted in a sensitivity to the small details that hold together the identity of the other that we encounter. So I think we really need to look at the details of, what exactly holds it together. You might say, it's all the history, the tradition, all the stuff. But I think that's kind of, the weight that we wrestle with as we move forward in ministry and through history and try to keep up with society and all these things. And I think the vulnerability is, when you try to understand kind of what makes something tick, or where is that stumbling block for a tradition in our conversation, or why can't they, join us on this side of the aisle on this particular issue? Well, that's a vulnerability, I think. And if we start from there, the tone of our conversations, the tone of our work together, the temperature of it really, gets to the right level. So I think what I learned from that little mishap was that I think we should approach everything we do ecumenically in a spirit of receptive accountability and sensitivity. And again, I find that this has been something that I could recognize, and I recognize very readily in terms of the Church of England. And my experience of the Church of England has been one where a sense of receptivity and sensitivity has been prevalent. And that has made me more accountable as well towards my own tradition, towards the ecumenical encounter itself, and towards the ecumenical encounter in the public social milieu. Now, so I think it's become very clear that I really think that this receptive accountability and sensitivity towards the other is the conduit in terms of the ecumenical conversation and engagement. And it's a conduit, on the one hand, between the mystical dimension of the Lord's injunction that we ought to love one another as He loved us, and that we should be one as He and the Father are one. So basically, in a sense, a conduit between a call to a mystical Trinitarian way of being, and on the other, the conduit for human in a human dimension that creates meaningful, enriching, listening. This wonderful word metanoic, which means the transformative relationships. And accountability is defined by the existence of the other, of another, whether that is God or my neighbor. And I think it's fundamental in the ecumenical conversation. And again, something that I, at the risk of laboring the point, I found in my experience of the Church of England. I think this receptive sensitivity towards the other and accountability is an eschatological virtue, because it heralds in the here and now the relational reality of the kingdom where we are all in God. If you think at Matthew 25, the criterion for judgment, in a sense, or for communion with God, is being attentive to the vulnerabilities of other people, not to their strengths, not when they're at their best. And what did you do when that was happening? And I mean, again, to give you an example, again, my experience has been this. I mean, when the Orthodox parish, the Romanian Orthodox parish in Cambridge started, but I mean, this goes even before that. I'll give you the example of the Russian Orthodox parish in Cambridge, which was there a good 20 years before the Romanian Orthodox parish started, about 10 years ago, or 11 years ago. To start something like that, a community with a number of people and trying to find a church or a place where you can worship, where you can gather for prayer, that's a very vulnerable place to be. And if somebody else looks at you as another Christian, another tradition, another priest, usually it was an Anglican priest or an Anglican chaplain, for example, at Westcott House, who welcomed the Russian parish there on Sundays. They notice that vulnerability and they respond to it in a Christ-like manner. I don't want to be critical of my own tradition, but I've often thought, would the reciprocal be happening if let's say in Romania or Russia or Greece, you would have a community of Anglican persons, with the priest saying, "Oh, we need a place of worship." Would somebody there open the church up and say, "Oh, you can worship with us, or you can share the space"? I don't know. Maybe that's a very tough question to ask. Of your own tradition. I would hope that yes, people would say that, because you always have to respond to but maybe it's contextual. Anyway. Yes. So receptive accountability that I keep talking about, I think, is related, is part and parcel of what has become the latest and currently the most potent conceptual structure, I think, in ecumenical encounter, which is this concept of receptive ecumenism. Paul Murray, up in Durham, the Professor Paul Murray, he has been the pioneer of this kind of theological framework for receptive ecumenism. And to me, I think it's the most potent, the one that really carries the most hope for the future in terms of how we discern and take forward the ecumenical conversation. And I think it's also, receptive ecumenism is more than a conceptual structure. It requires practical structures of receptivity as well. And receptive ecumenism is crucial to the entire ecumenical endeavor, I feel, because of the practical demands it places on what being ecumenical means. And you can only really fully be accountable in practice. So we may agree on this or that issue, and we may receive inspiring insights from one another and from various traditions. And this may lead to some degree of change in the nuances of our dialogue and theological formulations. But it is how we are accountable in practice that makes a difference. It is this incarnational aspect that changes reality. I want to give you a quick quote from Yves Congar, the famous Catholic theologian and leader, sort of a shining light of the ecumenical movement. He says at some point in one of his books, he says, the process by means of which a church body truly takes over as its own a resolution that it did not originate in regard to itself, and acknowledges the measure it promulgates as a rule applicable to its own life, that is to be receptive ecumenically. It includes a degree of consent and possibly of judgment in which the life of a body is expressed, which brings into play its own original spiritual resources. So this idea of being receptive doesn't mean that you have to let go of something, of your identity, of your practice, but it actually brings up something new in your own tradition, which otherwise would not be stimulated. So I think accountability and receptiveness, they are virtues, they're Christian virtues. And in this light, one may perceive accountability as discernment, which is conducive to spiritual and practical transformation of relationships, both of individuals and of communities. The virtue of discernment takes one on a journey from fear of the unknown or of the different to love. In this sense, receptive ecumenism as a model, I suppose, which I've seen at work in the Church of England, receptive ecumenism is accountability towards oneself and the other, is synonymous with Christological accountability, because you recognize the Christ in the other. For the Orthodox, I suppose, recognizing the Christ in the other could be translated in terms of illumination or deification. But nonetheless, this is a spiritual journey that cannot be separated from practical life sharing. In this, it is also a prophetic preparation of the eschatological manifestation and revelation of Christ, as I was mentioning, that we hear about in Matthew 25, the Christ in the other. Well, why do we need this receptiveness? Why do we need receptive ecumenism? Why do we need a receptive accountability in our ecumenical engagements? What's the problem that this solves? What's the problem that it addresses? And I think the problem that it addresses is ecclesial self-sufficiency. That we are enough. My church is enough. My tradition is enough. And the other is superfluous or something that I have to deal with on top of everything else. And that is a sort of a poison that if it comes in, it just completely distorts what being Christian means and what being a church means. And we have to deal with this kind of, I suppose, mantra, which sometimes you hear in without going political, but you hear it in political discourse that says kind of, all the problems of others are not our problems. You know? The problems of other churches, in a sense, are not our problems. Why should I get involved? They should sort out their own vulnerabilities. But this dynamic integrity of any church, or of the church, the dynamic integrity of any church or of the church as a whole is oriented towards or informed, I think, by this inward looking and longing for accountability. And it's flanked on one side by tradition, and on the other side by, I suppose, the dogma and the teaching and what makes a church, what gives a church its particular identity. But self-sufficiency is the antinomy of receptivity. Self-sufficiency, creates this kind of buffered ecclesial self, rather than one that's open. When we try to deal with this ecclesial self-sufficiency, what we have to do is receptively and accountably walk from the center of from our own tradition to the boundaries of it, which brings us in the space between boundaries, where we can genuinely listen and be interested in what happens within the boundaries of the other. And I've seen this in the Church of England as a distinct virtue. The ability to hold the center, although some might argue against this, even from within the Church of England. But I've seen this. It's amazing the level of tension that I think the Church of England can withstand and hold, I think, in a positive tension. This is how I see it from the outside, at least. So the ability to hold the center while traveling and existing authentically at the boundaries of its own ecclesial identity, which often is the place of encounter with the other. So this kind of receptive accountability that fights off ecclesial self-sufficiency, sort of, as I said, asks not what do the other first need to learn from us, but what is that we need to learn and can learn or receive with integrity from our other. That's something that Paul Murray actually puts in one of his first articles about receptive ecumenism and this kind of orientation. Now, I want to wrap it up now, and I really want to address, in a sense, what's the way forward? I mean, yes, we are receptive, we try to be receptive, we try to be accountable to our own tradition, to the gospel, to the context where we live in. Also, it's good to try and be accountable to the one that we call the other, because in a Christian sense, we cannot ignore the Christ in the other. Why should we develop, more in all of our churches a receptive sensitivity towards the other? Why should we do that? Well, as I said, because we have to be accountable to the gospel, to our own tradition, but also to the mission that we have in the world. Because all that we do as church, our ecclesial identity, is tested by the world. It's tested by the world. We proclaim the gospel in the world, Christ in the world, and we do that for the life of the world. And often the world looks at us and says, so what? The biggest problem that we have as churches today, I think, particularly in the West, is not outright opposition, but indifference. And that really places Christianity or us as churches into irrelevance, into the area of irrelevance, and that's a very difficult place to come back from. Because irrelevance, there's no engagement. You're just forgotten. You're not relevant to the conversation. So, I want to make 3 points as I conclude in this idea about how can we use this ecumenical encounter in the context of our world to make a difference, to fulfill Christ's commandment that our unity, our encounter, actually is so that the world may believe. So the first thing I want to say is I think we really need to think of the ecumenical crisis of our time, because we're in a bit of an ecumenical crisis. We've been trying to work things out together. The ecumenical movement, the modern ecumenical movement has been going on for at least 70 years, if not longer. It depends where you want to sort of place it as the beginning. But the ecumenical crisis of unity and relevance in a secular world, in a pluralistic world, in a money and power-oriented world, I would say I like this. I like this comparison, in a sense. And I think it's useful. This is the equivalent of the climate crisis. And until we start to think of an ecumenical crisis as the equivalent of a climate crisis, we're not going to do much. We're going to be complacent in church self-sufficiency and sort of, not giving, not bothering too much. What do I mean by this? The pronouncements of climate advocates and scientists calling for the enacting of urgent and meaningful climate policies is as radical as it is simple. The planet will not be protected and it will not be saved except by concerted and concrete common action from each and every one of the world's countries. And this is a warning we ought to appropriate theologically in the ecosystem of the Christian world. And the partial failure of ecumenism to deliver on the promise of unity adds to the wider sinfulness of the world. We have to consider this as well, which is manifest as dividedness, greed, lust for power, and injustice. And these elements shape the being of the world, our zeitgeist, even as the world seeks healing. And as no one country can have an impact on the planet's damaged climate on its own, neither can individual churches make a difference in and for the life of the world on their own, without a synergic ecumenical effort, without renewed ecumenical synergy, without common, coherent, joined-up witness. Christ's redemptive sacrifice is parochialized and denominationalized instead of being affirmed in its universality. The world looks at us and says, you're all selling the same thing at different stalls. You're not convincing anybody. The sobering reality is that much like the climate crisis, the many meetings and declarations issued over decades of ecumenical dialogue have done little or too little to lower the ecumenical temperature of our ecclesial milieu, and we have to do better. Now, what else can we do? I think instead of ecclesial self-sufficiency, we really need to develop more purposefully ecclesial interdependence, as I said, as opposed to this ecclesial self-sufficiency. I'll give you another short quote from Yves Congar, who goes like this. He says, "The discovery of another spiritual world does not uproot us from our own," he means in the tradition of another, "but changes the way we look at many things. For myself, I remain a Catholic, a fact I do not hide from myself or from others, but ecumenism has freed me from a certain narrowness of outlook, characteristic of the Latin and of the Mediterranean man, by bringing me into touch with Eastern Christians, Scandinavians, Anglo-Saxons, and with their respective traditions. I have kept my Latin anthropological makeup, but have looked critically upon its limitations." He writes this in 1963. So, ecumenism is not a panacea for the crisis of relevance and witness that confronts traditional forms of Christianity today, but I think it provides a context in which Christian churches can look at solutions together and learn from each other, from mistakes and successes both. Ecclesial self-sufficiency postulates that the problems of other churches are not our problems. Ecumenism affirms that we cannot insulate ourselves ecclesiologically from the global Christian ecosystem. In this context, failure to shift from ecclesial self-sufficiency and subscribe with urgency and accountability to the imperative for ecclesial interdependence and a greater degree of receptivity would be to bury one's talent, as the parable says. And the last thing I want to stress again is that no church can make a difference in the world on its own. I think I really need to stress that we need to realize that the only way forward towards the radical transformation of the world is through ecumenical effort, even it is an imperfect effort. And it must be about the realization that it will remain an imperfect effort while it is not committed to with a sense of urgency and humble openness towards one another. And I had with me, I do promise that this is my last sort of sentence, my last minute and a half. I have with me this wonderful book with texts from Father Alexander Mann. He was a Russian Orthodox priest. He was murdered in 1990, just as sort of communism was going away, to a degree in Russia. But in his last public speech, in his last public lecture, he really addressed the theme of Christianity for the 21st century. And he said there something that's incredibly hopeful. He says this, and I think that's a good note to end on. He says, Christ calls people to bring the divine ideal to reality. This divine ideal of unity and love and live cooperation. Only short-sighted people imagine that Christianity has already happened. that it took place, say in the 13th century or the 4th or some other time. I would say that it has only made the first hesitant steps in the history of the human race. So in 1990, he says, Christianity is only just beginning, basically 2,000 years after Christ. So I think we can look with hope on the future, because we've only really just begun. And what we might feel like ecumenical dialogue that's stalled, that's made no real progress, or some progress but not enough in 100 years, that might just be the 0.1% of a process that is still sort of to unfold. So I think that's a very hopeful tone to end. Thank you very much.
Father, thank you so much for such a deep and rich plumbing of the depths of what it means for Christians to relate to one another, but also I think the human condition. I think you've kind of touched on so many things here that have helped us not just be good ecumenists, but better Christians, better sisters and brothers, from exploring the importance of addressing one another's vulnerability, to the dangers of the assumption of self-sufficiency, either as a church or even indeed as individuals. Your call to practical action as a demonstration of what we believe, I think is crucial, and you certainly have demonstrated that in your coming here this evening, sharing your wisdom and your thoughtfulness. So I just really want to thank you so much.
Thank you.
I actually, a number of years ago, was in Russia on an ecumenical visit from the Church of England to the Russian Orthodox Church before the invasion of Ukraine, of course, and was able to go to Alexander Men's town and met his brother and the community there, and that absolute kind of commitment to trying to seek a bigger story, a bigger truth, a bigger world, and a deepening of relationships absolutely has to be at the heart of our ecumenical vision. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Father.
We've got time now for some questions. I'm conscious that this may be perhaps the first time any of you have ever met an Orthodox priest. So there may well be just kind of really normal, kind of basic questions of what's the difference? I mean, so please do kind of throw this as wide as possible. This is an opportunity to deepen our relationships with each other and to come to a greater understanding. I do a lot of work with the Orthodox Church in my sort of kind of spare time, and for me, reminding ourselves that Christianity is indeed an Eastern faith is fundamental and kind of opens up a whole world here. So please do ask Father Dragos as many questions as you can, and I'll bring the microphone round for those who might want to. I'll go with Laura first and then.
Thank you. I was always really struck. I mean, I think some of the stuff you said at the beginning really resonated with me, from living in Westcott House and being amongst people of different denominations within the Cambridge Theological Federation and worshipping alongside one another, learning alongside one another, really helped me with that respect for the other. But I'm also really aware that as soon as we come away from that situation, and we are now all in our own kind of areas, it's really easy to forget the other. What one thing do you think we can do to try and remember to look outwards, or to help with that relationship with other denominations and other histories within Christianity, and not just keep looking to our own church building or church community?
Yeah. I think it's about not letting our senses be dulled by routine and by complacency. I don't know, maybe it's not the best quote, but it just came to me. I think it was in Norwich. I was in Norwich many years ago, and I can't remember. I think it's still there. There was a building, and on top of the building, I think they really made an effort. I'm not sure whether it was a banner or something, but it says, it was a quote by somebody, and it says, lick the lollipop of mediocrity and you'll suck forever. And I said, I must remember this. It's so cool. So I really think it's like, once you start feeling that, oh, this is all too cozy, this is all, it's easy, Christianity is easy, then you should really be afraid. Because Christianity is not meant to be easy. Christianity is not meant to be comfortable. It's not meant to be cozy. It's not to say that you always have to be in an upheaval and ready to throw ourselves for martyrdom or whatever. But the point is that Christianity is always trying to seek Christ in the other, and it has to feel like a continual challenge, institutionally, personally. So I really think that that's, I suppose, one of the things that we need to have on our radar. Once it starts to get very familiar and we feel that there's no challenge, that's when I think we need to take note and say, what's actually happening? Have I created a bubble? So we really need to feel challenged in that way. And maybe revisit the places that, particularly like you were saying with Westcott, places that we say maybe had an impact in our formation, or places that have really made an impression on us, and say, well, let me see how things are, reconnect with those things, with that reality, and challenge ourselves. I think that's one way to avoid falling into, as I said, easy Christianity or cozy Christianity. That's very dangerous, cozy Christianity. Yeah. Thank you.
Father Dragos, sorry. I'm going to ask some really, really basic questions, fully display my ignorance. Which branch of the Orthodox Church are you from? Are you
the best? The
right,
best.
okay.
The best.
Armenian Orthodox or Russian?
No, Romanian. Romanian Orthodox. Because at some point, all of these European empires dismantled, and you had the rise of the national states in the second part of the 19th century and the early 20th century. Orthodoxy, which used to be basically, I don't want to say an amorphous, but it was basically the faith of a lot of people populating Eastern Europe and Greece, obviously, and Russia, obviously. But once you started having national states, people said, well, we must have institutions that reflect the shape of our national state. So then, if we have a state that's called Romania, we need to have a Romanian Orthodox Church that has its own patriarchal jurisdiction, that kind of thing. So, in that sense, you have this fragmentation on a level where it says you have Romanian Orthodox, you have Russian Orthodox, you have Greek Orthodox, you have Serbian Orthodox, you have Bulgarian Orthodox, you have and that's a very artificial, to a degree, separation, because they are all in communion, they profess the same faith, they share much of the history in terms of the theology, but also regional history, and that often creates confusion. It's also a very unfortunate, syntactic or linguistic way of expressing it, because you always have to put the national or the ethnic kind of label in front of that. I think maybe more properly, and we might have to work a lot to change this in the way that we express things, one should actually say the Orthodox Church in Romania, the Orthodox Church in Russia, because then the emphasis would be on the shared heritage and the shared faith rather than on the ethnicity that comes first. So yes, I belong to the Romanian Orthodox Church, but as you say, so maybe it's more proper to say, as properly you say, the Anglican Church in Ghana or the Anglican Church in, I don't know, South America, or things like this, rather than, yeah.
Okay. So just expanding on that, I mean, I get your point. Essentially,
Yes,
the
yeah.
Orthodox Church in whichever country, but we are all Christians. We have the same fundamental beliefs.
Yes.
So Orthodoxy is then more, if I understand correctly, more a function of that fragmentation in Eastern Europe. I said sort of
I
right.
suppose Father Dragos might argue that it's the other way around. That
Okay.
we exist because of the fragmentation from them. So you
Yeah.
So I don't know if I'm making sense, but yeah. So essentially, we have the same belief, and then, as you say, Orthodoxy is just developed, perhaps by means of the way it's spread through the Eastern region. Is that correct?
Well,
Sorry.
not quite. So, the church was always Orthodox, okay, because in a sense, but it didn't carry the label, to put it this way, like this. It didn't carry this appropriation. You start having this use of Catholic and Orthodox and all of these adjectives, or whatever you want to call them, really from the 11th century, more or less, when you really have that split between Rome and Constantinople. 1054, kind of, it's kind of the year that people assign to this kind of split between Rome and Constantinople, or between Western Christianity and Eastern Christianity. Again, Western and Eastern Christianity are sort of labels that kind of follow the split of the Roman Empire. You had a center in Rome, and then you had the new capital in Constantinople. After the fall of Rome, things started to get a bit more complicated. But in the East, while they had an emperor, and more or less the eastern part of the empire, the church felt that there was a lot more continuity with what happened before. Because from Constantine, you always had Christianity as a legal religion, became the religion of the Roman Empire. And then you had this connection between the seat of political power and the seat of religious leadership, to put it this way. And because there was more continuity in the East than Constantinople became sort of Rome remained as the kind of original center of focus, and Constantinople became the new Rome, as it was called. Now, the point is that, as I said, the church was always Orthodox, the church was always Catholic. But once you started having those differences in development, because there was an empire that was continuing in the East, there was a fragmentation in the West, and so on, then you started to develop a little bit differently. Some traditions are different, and then you realize that some of the theology is different. Not in the big things. Nobody thinks that there's a trinity of 4 people or whatever, I have to put it this way. But there were differences, and then once the people realized, well, some of these differences are, we need to think a little bit more about them, and then you throw in a bit of personality, and tantrums of leaders, you get splits, to put it this way. So what we call now the Orthodox Church feels as it is it inherits the tradition from the very beginning, from Pentecost, and then from Constantine and everything else, through the medium of the sort of Roman Empire that stayed in Constantinople and became the Byzantine Empire, and so on. So these are unfortunate sort of denominational almost labels that we have to work with today. But you're absolutely right. There is one, the faith is the same fundamentally. But because of this fragmentation and lack of communion and conversation, whatever regional developments happened started to develop in a bubble, as it were. You know, almost like Darwin, he goes and says, these are the same birds, but on this island where they have no contact with each other, they developed a little bit differently. And then you have to assign them a different name and, you know, things like this. So the whole impetus of the ecumenical movement is to try and sort of patch these things together and kind of rewind the whole process of fragmentation and distancing that occurred over so many centuries. Yeah. But I hope that answered in a very long-winded way, but it's 2,000 years almost.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
1700.
You did an
at
amazing
least,
job
yeah.
to wrap up 1,000+ years of history. Any other questions? We can ask questions with Father Dragos over drink, so don't feel pressured to do so now. In which case,
thank you so much for the talk, and
you.
thank you everyone for making time to be here and for the questions as well. And may God bless your ministry and everyone that supports you in the ministry, from the family to everyone here in the parish. So thank you very much again.
Thank you. Please, another round of applause.